Hello, St. Peter's. Welcome back for the next two chapters in our chapter book series, The World According to Humphrey. This is already week 12. Can you believe it? We are off this week because yesterday was Thanksgiving. I hope you all had a fantastic Thanksgiving with your families in your homes, all safe and sound. I had a delicious Thanksgiving. Today, we're going to continue with our chapters from our Humphrey book. Now, do you remember what happened last week? Well, remember, he was still at the principal's house and they had to teach those kids a lesson, and they did. Humphrey and Mr. Morales were able to show the children that if they were patient and quiet, Humphrey would do what they wanted to do. So that was pretty cool. He also helped his friend Aldo by putting up that advertisement for the Moonlighters Club for the people who worked at night so he could meet somebody to have a friend during the day. And also, big excitement, Ms. Mack wrote a letter he was so excited and happy about. And big excitement number 2, Saya gets to take him home. And I think these chapters are going to show us what happens when he goes home with Saya. So are you ready? Do you have your friends? I have my friends. I have Ralph, Magic Monkey, Daisy's right here, our Pig of Joy, and of course, our Jar of Joy. So snuggle up, settle in, so you can listen to chapters 7 and 8 of The World According to Humphrey. Chapter 7, Saya Speaks Up. On Friday afternoon, Saya's father, Mr. Nasiri, picked us up after school. He had a friendly smile and gentle eyes, but he was as quiet as his daughter. Saya lived in a tall building, so Mr. Nasiri carried my cage up 1, 2, 3 flights of stairs to her clean and quiet apartment. Mrs. Nasiri opened the door for us. She spoke to her husband and daughter, but I couldn't exactly understand what they were saying. "Hummy, hummy," a little voice called out. Saya's little brother, Derek, toddled toward the door to greet me. "Say Humphrey," Saya gently corrected him. "Hummy," he said. The Nasiris put the cage in the living room, right in the middle of a big table. Then they pulled up chairs so they could all sit and stare into my cage. It seemed as if they were waiting for something to happen. So I decided to give them a show. First, I spun on my wheel for a while. Well, then I climbed up the side of the cage and dived down into a pile of soft paper. They were obviously impressed with my performance as they talked quietly. The funny thing is, I couldn't understand a word they were saying. No wonder Saya gets 100% on all of her vocabulary tests. She and her family knew a lot more words than I did. They finally went to the kitchen to eat dinner. Later, while the rest of the family watched television, Saya's mother quietly sat by my cage watching me. She seemed nice. Eventually, it was bedtime for the Narinis. But after the lights went out, Saya slipped out of her room and came back to my cage and whispered to me. I could understand her again. "Now you know my secret, Humphrey," she whispered. "My family doesn't speak English. Well, my dad does a little, but he's shy about it. Mom hasn't learned any English at all, and Derek's too little." "I understand," I squeaked. "That's why I don't like to talk in class," she explained. "I don't talk like the other kids. I'm afraid they'll laugh at my accent. That happened to me when I was little." "But you don't sound different," I frantically squeaked. "I understand you just fine." Unfortunately, she didn't understand me. All she heard was squeak, squeak, squeak. I guess maybe I have an accent too. "But I have an idea that maybe you could help me teach my mom English," Saya continued. "Glad to help out if I can," I squeaked to her. "You're a real friend," Saya replied. See, she understood me after all. The next day I dozed until late afternoon when Saya led her mother back to my cage. Humphrey only understands English, Mama, Saya said. Speak English. Say Humphrey. Saya's mom looked a little frightened, but she tried. Humphrey, she said. Hummy! Derek cried as he raced into the room and climbed onto his mother's lap. Say, hello, Humphrey, Saya gently instructed her mother. Hello, Humphrey, Mrs. Nasiri said. I squeaked hello right back, and she broke into a huge smile. Hello, she said. Good job, I said. Well, things went swimmingly from then on. In a matter of hours, Saya's mom was saying, how do you do? Nice to meet you. Would you like some water? I did, thank you. Even when Saya and Derek left to go to the store with their father, Mrs. Nasiri kept on talking. I let her know I understood what she was saying by wiggling my whiskers and hanging my one paw from the top of my cage. Good boy, Humphrey, she said. Saya and her father were amazed at Mrs. Nasiri's progress when they returned. The family spent the rest of the evening practicing English. First, Saya pretended to be a guest at the door. She went into the hall and knocked. Her mother opened the door. Hello, Saya, she said. Won't you come in? Then Derek went out and knocked. Mrs. Nasiri opened the door and said, Hello, Derek. Won't you come in? He rushed and toddled right over to the table, shouting, Hummy, hummy! Next, Saya convinced her dad to practice English with her mom. What time is it? Asked Mrs. Nasiri. What time it is? Asked Mrs. Nasiri. What time is it? Saya corrected her. Mrs. Nasiri got it right the second time. Then Dad looked at his watch. 7:15, he answered. Would you like some tea? Mrs. Nasiri asked. Yes, please. I would like some tea, Mr. Nasiri answered. Guess what? They had a tea party right on my table. As a reward for all their hard work, I spun my wheel as fast as my legs would go, and they all cheered. Later, after the lights went out, Saya slipped out of her room to talk to me again. Thank you, Humphrey, she whispered. My mom says she's ready to go to English class now, but I wish you were the teacher. So do I squeaked, and I meant it. There were more English lessons on Sunday, and Saya showed Derek how to clean out my cage. Suddenly the boy began to giggle. Humphrey poop, he yelled. His English was improving too. On Sunday night, Saya gathered her family together again. I want to teach you the American song, she said. Then she opened her mouth and began to sing. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? I stood up just like we do in the classroom when the Star-Spangled Banner is being sung, but I'd never heard it sung like that before. Saya had the most beautiful voice in the world. It was like a gentle breeze. No, like rippling waters. No, it was beautiful. If only our classmates in room 26 could hear that. Which gave me the start of another idea. But I didn't have time to think much at all because soon the whole family was singing the Star-Spangled Banner and I squeaked right along with them, even on those high notes. When we got back to school on Monday morning, though, I was a little disappointed. Mrs. Brisbane asked Saya how things were over the weekend. Fine, said Saya, and nothing more. Like Ms. Mack said, you can learn a lot about yourself by getting to know another species. But boy, sometimes it's a lot of work. That Monday, I sat in my cage worrying about Saya for quite a while before I dozed off. When I woke up, I noticed that room 26 had changed. The bulletin board was covered with brightly colored leaves. The tops of the chalkboards were lined with big paper witches and ghosts and skeletons. Hanging from the light fixtures were black crepe paper hats. Then I looked to my right and gasped. A horrible, huge orange face with an evil grin was staring directly at me. I jumped back, my heart pounding. "Hey, Humphrey, don't you like that old pumpkin head?" AJ whispered to me from a seat nearby. "Look, Humphrey's scared of a little old jack-o'-lantern," Garth said. "Scaredy cat, scaredy hamster." I stood up straight and looked as unscared as I possibly could. "Quiet, Garth and AJ," said Mrs. Brisbane. Then she quickly returned to a math problem she was writing on the board. Suddenly, I noticed a little movement in the center of the room. A murmur. A change. I looked over, and yes! Saya had her hand up. Everyone noticed it, except Mrs. Brisbane, who had her back to the rest of us. "Mrs. Brisbane," Heidi called out. Without turning, the teacher said, "Raise your hand, Heidi." Now Heidi had her hand raised as well as Saya. "Well, what is it?" Mrs. Brisbane turned to face the class and was obviously surprised at what she saw. "Yes, Saya," she said. In a loud, clear voice, Saya said, "May I move the pumpkin away from Humphrey's cage?" Mrs. Brisbane looked from Saya to the cage and back. "Yes, I guess it is a little close. Thank you, Saya." Saya rose and hurried to my table to push the ugly old jack-o'-lantern away. She didn't say a word, but she winked at me, and I knew what she meant. "Heidi, did you want to say something?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. "Not anymore," she said. Everything went back to normal until the bell rang for recess. As my classmates all scattered and ran toward the door, Garth paused at my cage. "Scaredy cat," he muttered. Then he moved the pumpkin right up against my cage again. I puffed on my cheeks as big as I could get them. It was going to be a very long day. Here's our tip for the end of the chapter. Tip 7. When hamsters feel intimidated, they often puff up their cheeks, just like Humphrey was doing at the end of that chapter. Boy, we don't know why Garth is getting so angry with Humphrey all of a sudden, right? Let's find out. Chapter 8, Tricks and Treats. Halloween or Halloween or Halloween. I wasn't sure what it was, but I was pretty sure I didn't like it. Especially on Monday night after Mrs. Brisbane turned out the lights. That's when those skeletons on the wall took on an eerie glow. The bats hanging from the ceiling began to whirl and twirl, and the smile on that ghastly orange pumpkin face looked more like a wicked smirk. Weird. So I was thrilled when Aldo flicked on the lights. "Whoa, it looks like Halloween in here," he exclaimed as he wheeled in his cleaning cart. He strolled over to my cage as usual and bent down so we were face to face. "So, are you going to wear a costume for Halloween? It's Wednesday, you know. Halloween is when the ghosts and goblins come out to play," he explained. "Eek," I squeaked. No, it's not scary, it's just fun. All the kids will wear costumes. Richie's going to be a werewolf. So what are you going to wear? A fur coat?" He laughed at his own joke. Then he began his cleaning routine, talking to me as he swept and dusted. I started thinking about this costume thing. Ms. Mack had a costume party once while I was staying with her. People dressed up like kings and pirates and ghosts. And Ms. Mack dressed up like a clown with a sparkly pink wig and a funny face. Nobody wore a fur coat. I thought about this costume thing all night and the next day. When Garth threw a piece of wadded up paper in my cage, I wondered about all the costumes. When AJ tripped on his way up to the chalkboard and Gail didn't giggle, I wondered about the costumes. Even when Mrs. Brisbane called on Saya and she answered her, I wondered about the costumes, and I came up with a plan of my own. On Wednesday, Halloween arrived, but there were no costumes. I was extremely disappointed until Heidi blurted out, "Mrs. Brisbane, when are we going to have the party?" "Raise your hand, Heidi," the teacher told her. Heidi obediently raised her hand, and Mrs. Brisbane called on her. This time, when Heidi asked her question, Mrs. Brisbane said, "We will have our lessons this morning. After lunch, you may put on your costumes and we'll start the party." I felt happy, and got in a nice nap for the rest of the morning. But I was wide awake after lunch. My classmates returned from the cafeteria, then scurried off to the cloakroom and the bathrooms, and returned. But I hardly recognized them in their costumes. Oh, they were wonderful. A dragon, 2 pirates, a princess, a ninja, 2 clowns, a ballerina, a bunny, a cat, thank goodness, not a real one, a baseball player, a mad scientist, a skeleton, the Statue of Liberty, an angel, and a devil. The Room mothers came to help at the party. They were both dressed as witches. Still, Mrs. Brisbane was the scariest of them all. She didn't wear a costume, just a button that had the words, "This is my costume," printed on it. She gathered everyone in a circle, pushing all the tables back. Then she announced that the class would be having some treats. But in order to get them, they each had to do a trick, tell a joke, sing a song, or perform a trick for the rest of the class. Oh, I wish someone had told me. I had figured out the costume part. But what about this tricking for treats? Art, the ninja, stood on his head. He stood on his head so long, Mrs. Brisbane finally had to thank him and tell him it was someone else's turn. Gail, the ballerina, twirled around the room on her toes. Garth, baseball player, told a joke about a witch. Miranda, the bunny, sang a funny song about your ears hanging low. It was all very entertaining, except for the fact that I was thinking about something else. But Mrs. Brisbane got my full attention when she called on Saya. Saya was dressed as the Statue of Liberty. She wore a flowing dress and had a crown on her head and a big cardboard torch in one hand. She stared down at the floor as she took her place in the center of the circle. What trick will you do for us, Saya?" the teacher asked. Saya stared at the floor. "Sing your song, Saya! Sing!" I squeaked out as loudly as I could. "You can do it, Saya! Sing!" Yes, I know all she could hear was squeak, 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 but I did my best. "I think Humphreys wants to hear from you," said Mrs. Brisbane in a surprisingly friendly voice. Suddenly, without warning, Saya began to sing the Star-Spangled Banner in her clear, sweet voice. Everyone stood up right away like you're supposed to when they sing the national anthem. Mrs. Brisbane put her hand over her heart, and the other kids did too. Well, pay attention, Art didn't until his mom came over and whispered in his ear. I stood up too, as proud as a hamster could possibly be. When it was over, no one clapped or said a word. It seemed as if those sweet notes were still drifting around the room. "That was lovely, Saya. Thank you for sharing your beautiful voice with us," Mrs. Brisbane said. I wish she'd speak that way to me someday. Nice, encouraging, friendly. Anyway, the tricks continued. And after AJ told a few riddles, Mrs. Brisbane looked around the circle and said, "Did I miss anyone?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. No one had noticed, but the night before I had sneaked one of Aldo's white dusting cloths into my sleeping hut. I had to act quickly. I pulled out the cloth and crawled under it so I was completely covered. Then I stood up and began to shout like I'd never shouted before. "Trick or squeak!" I cried. "Trick or squeak!" Miranda noticed first. "Look," she yelled, "it's Humphrey!" I wish I could have seen the faces on my classmates, but it was dark, dark, dark under the cloth. I could hear them, though. First there were gasps, then giggles, then shouts of, "Look!" and "Humphrey's a ghost!" I continued to squeak my heart out until I heard Mrs. Brisbane's firm footsteps coming towards my cage. "Who did this?" she asked. "Who put that on Humphrey?" No one answered, of course, not even me. "He could suffocate under that," she said. "But he looks so cute," Heidi called out. Mrs. Brisbane didn't answer. She just said, "Will someone please uncover him?" Golden Miranda opened the cage door and whisked the cloth away. "Humphrey, you are a riot," she said. "Only a riot? Let's be honest here. I was a smash hit." Then the room mother served up cupcakes with orange icing and cups of apple juice, and my classmates played games. Just before the bell rang, Mrs. Brisbane clapped her hands and made an announcement. "Mrs. Hopper and Mrs. Patel and I have consulted with one another. We have decided to give the prize for best trick to Saya Nasiri." Everyone clapped and cheered as Mrs. Brisbane handed Saya a blue ribbon. Saya looked over at me and smiled a beautiful smile. Mrs. Brisbane continued, "And we have decided to award the prize for best costume to Humphrey." She walked over to my cage and taped a big blue ribbon to it while my classmates cheered for me. "Thank you," I squeaked, but I'm not sure anyone could hear me over all the noise. "Thank you all." The bell rang and the room was soon empty, except for Mrs. Brisbane. As she gathered up her papers to take home, Mr. Morales came in. He was dressed in a cap and gown like people wear when they are graduating. "Happy Halloween, Sue! Did you have a good party?" he asked. "Very," she answered. "Somehow your friend over there got hold of a ghost costume and won the prize." "See, I told you he'd add a lot to your classroom," he said with a smile. "He has livened things up," said Mrs. Brisbane. Joy, joy, joy! I believed she was starting to like me. "Just so he doesn't liven things up too much," she added. Poof! My hopes of winning over Mrs. Brisbane's heart crashed to the ground. Mr. Morales said his kids kept asking about me, and then he quickly left. Mrs. Brisbane headed out the door after him. There I was, all alone in room 26 with a bunch of half-tom bats and tattered skeletons hanging, or half-torn bats and tattered skeletons hanging around me. As I waited for Aldo to arrive, I sat in the darkening room and pondered my job as a classroom pet. Had I really accomplished anything? Mr. Morales's children seemed to settle down when I was there. Saya's mother began to learn English, and Saya would probably never have sung in front of the class without my encouragement. Still, Mrs. Brisbane was not won over. Neither was Garth Tugwell, although it seemed as if he had liked me well enough in the beginning. Now he always muttered things at me as he passed by my cage. I noticed that he was the only one in class who didn't cheer when I won the award for best costume. I was still worrying about Garth when the lights temporarily blinded me as Aldo sailed into the classroom yelling, "Trick or treat!" He was wearing his usual shirt, dark pants, and heavy shoes, but on his face he wore huge glasses with a bulbous nose attached. The center of the glasses had giant eyeballs painted on with circles of red veins. His floppy mustache drooped out from under the nose. "Great costume," I squeaked. "Hey, what's this?" Aldo rushed forward to examine my blue ribbon. "Best costume? For a fur coat? I'll have to ask Richie about that," he said. Aldo reached into his lunchbox and pulled out a juicy slice of apple. "I've got a special Halloween treat for you, Humphrey, 'cause I'm very, very happy tonight," he said. I grabbed the apple and began nibbling as Aldo pulled his chair up close to my cage. "You see, I went to the Moonlighters Club. You remember the club in that ad I found on the projector? I squeaked in excited yes. And I met a real nice girl there named Maria. She works out all night at the bakery. So tomorrow we're going out on a date, lunch and a movie. Aldo leaned back in his chair. She's a real nice girl. Pretty, nice. Did I tell you she works in a bakery? Aldo rose and paced back and forth in front of my cage. You know what I can't figure? I can't figure out how that ad got on that projector. Mrs. Brisbane wouldn't show that to the class. And she wouldn't be interested herself. And it was weird how the projector was left on. Mrs. Brisbane always leaves her room in ship-shape condition. He paused to rub his chin, then looked at me out of the corner of his eye. You know, if you weren't locked up in a cage, I'd think you had something to do with it, he said. Then he laughed. Well, whoever it was, I owe them a big thank you. You're welcome, I squeaked. Too bad Aldo didn't understand me this time. Pretty good. Here's our tip for the end of the chapter. Tip 8. Hamsters are most active during the evening. From the Guide to the Care and Feeding of Hamsters by Dr. Harvey H. Hammer. We always get some good tips. What do you think about that? Boy, were those chapters full of good news. Saya came out of her shell, so she wasn't quite so shy. Her mother learned to start speaking English. Aldo found a girlfriend. They had a Halloween party. Humphrey won a blue ribbon. Holy cow, that was a lot of good news. What do you think? I think it was good news too. Let me put in my bookmark so we're ready for next week. All right. I'm really enjoying this book. I hope you are too. I think that hamster is a really cool class pet. Wouldn't it be neat to have a classroom pet just like Humphrey? I think so too. And I think Humphrey would love if we spread some joy. What do you say, Joy? Humphrey would love it. We love it. We're going to make some people happy today. You ready? Let's see how we're going to do that. Open it up. Oh, this is a good one. We have a nice couple more days of the weekend. It says, send a card to a helper. Now, I think we may have actually talked about this last week. It doesn't have to be a card. It can be a picture, a note, anything that you can find. And a helper is anyone who helps you, right? We know about our hero helpers, our doctors and nurses, and our firefighters, and our policemen. But what about the other helpers? Like your teachers and your parents, or maybe a big brother or sister, maybe a grandma or grandpa, or an aunt or an uncle, someone who has done something really nice for you. You could do something nice for them. Send them a card. It's always nice to know that people are thinking about you, right? All right, boys and girls, until next Friday when we read a few more adventures of Humphrey, go and have some fun, and most importantly, go spread your joy.